Welcome to Catholic Feedback. I'm your host, Keith Nestor. On this podcast, we connect the eternal truths of the Catholic faith with everyday life. Send in your questions and comments to feedback@catholicfeedback.com. This podcast is brought to you by Down to Earth Ministry, a ministry of stewardship, a mission of faith, and by the generous support of our patrons. For more information, please visit downtoearthministry.org. That's down, the number 2, earthministry.org. Let's get to it. Well, hey, friends, welcome to Catholic Feedback. I'm Keith Nestor, and on this podcast, we connect the eternal truths of the Catholic faith to everyday life. I'm very excited today to welcome a man that I have been following for quite a while now on the issue of Eastern Orthodoxy. And this is an issue that, for me, honestly, when I became Catholic, I wasn't aware of all of the differences and the contentions. I became a Catholic and basically because that's what I was exposed to. But it wasn't long before I began to hear about the churches of the East and in Eastern Orthodoxy and became fascinated with that. Well, my guest today is an expert on that, and he is well versed in the differences and the similarities and what divides us and what can bring us together. He's written an incredible book on the papacy, by the way, Revisiting the Debate between Catholics and Orthodox. I'm joined today by Mr. Erick Ybarra, and Erick is going to share some incredible things with us. So, Erick, welcome to Catholic Feedback. It's an honor to have you here, my friend.
Oh, Keith, thank you so much for having me on. I'm blessed to be here. Thank you.
Well, how are things going down? You live in Florida, right?
I live in Central Florida. Yeah, things are going good. It's been a little chilly here the last few days. But of course, chilly for us is like, 55 degrees, right?
You get no sympathy from me here. We've had snow and cold, and it's going to get worse. But man,
yeah. So I lived in Wisconsin for 3 years,
and
so I know what it is like. I'm originally from Miami Beach, so going from Florida to Wisconsin was a huge transition. But yeah, I know what the snow is like, and I'm glad to be out of it.
Well, yeah, I can relate to that. So, Erick, you've got a long story of different places that you've been. I've listened to a lot of your stuff, and you were a Reformed Baptist for a time. You were Anglican. And before we get into this whole thing about Eastern Orthodoxy, I want to know a little bit about you and your background. Let our listeners know kind of your journey through faith and through church.
Yeah, absolutely. So, from Miami, I was born into a Spanish family. We're Puerto Rican, Cuban descent. My biological father is actually Irish, so some people don't. Sometimes they see that like, well, you look kind of Mediterranean, Italian. So my dad was Irish, Cherokee Indian. My mother was Puerto Rican and mostly Puerto Rican. And of course, was raised in the Catholic Church, so I received my sacraments early on. And but when I hit when I hit 8th grade, I started reading books on science and philosophy. And that's when I started to develop a question for what else is out there besides religion, and I became an atheist, agnostic, and that's what I was for all my high school years until I came to university. And when I was on university, I met a Reformed Baptist evangelist who got my eyes reading the New Testament, and boy, I had just a radical conversion experience into a Baptist community, evangelical community, that they tried to model themselves off of the early patristic church without all the sacramentology and the things like that. So we kind of viewed it as eat the meat, spit out the bones, but we would read early Christians. And so we had an ascetic discipline, community discipline. There was a pretty harsh system of accountability. So if you weren't following the Lord and in a certain way, Matthew 18 and 1 Corinthians 5 was like a go-to, for excommunications. But then, I went to look at the roots of the faith, and I realized that Christianity is much larger than that small community I was involved with. And so I kind of swept through the horizon from going into Lutheran churches, sitting down with Lutheran priests and getting all the literature that they could give me, read a ton on the Reformation, Fell in love with the Chadwick brothers. They wrote, they're Anglicans, but they wrote a ton on the Reformation. And then I found a happy home in Canterbury as an Anglican, but more on the Anglo-Catholic side of things. And when I was, but before getting to this, when I was in that Baptist church, we were out there preaching the gospel. I was open air preaching. Anybody who went to UCF, beginning in 2005, 2006, 2007, they might have seen me on the free speech screen with a John MacArthur study Bible, going through Luke 9, and counting the cost and carrying the cross and talking about all that stuff. So if you probably don't recognize me, I was a lot lighter then. But we used to get on buses and ask for the speaker and ask for the radio, and we would just open up the Bible and read in front of abortion mills. We would just get up and pray. So we were a vibrant community. So for me to make this transition, it took a lot of undoing. And so I became more, historically conscious, but I was yearning for the roots of the faith. I was kind of tired of making things up on my own and thinking that the Holy Spirit's leading me to, disciple people in my living room, because that's literally what I did. I decked out my living room with whiteboards and chairs, made it into like a class, and I'd have people over from everywhere to come over and learn about the faith. So becoming an Anglican was a huge change for me. And when I was there, I thought that I could be historically minded without putting my neck out to the guillotine of Catholicism or Orthodoxy. But when I was there, a lot of the parishioners there were theologians, Christian professors. They were people who were linguists. The intellectual pedigree at that parish was different than what I had been used to as a Baptist. No denigration to the Baptists. It's just the literature, the kind of literature sometimes can be different. Whereas I was reading Spurgeon and the Puritans and Leonard Ravenhill, Richard Owen Roberts. Now I see people walking around with books on the Desert Fathers, St. Maximus the Confessor, St. John Damascus, and so I start reading new books from these guys in the past, and I started realizing that the ecclesial consciousness of the church fathers was radically, diametrically opposed to what I was thinking as an Anglican. And so that forced me to look further along the trail. So I thought the trail was going to end for me at Canterbury. Of course, I wasn't involved with the Church of England. I was part of an offshoot, Anglo-Catholic continuum in the United States. But I realized the trail would be a little bit further along to bring me to that fork between the Byzantine Church and the Catholic Church, the Bosphorus versus the Tiber. And it was there that I realized that I needed to study this issue more and more. And it wasn't going to get resolved overnight. So it took me a long time. I realized that after a while, I had all these composition notebooks with my own notes on the matter. So that's when I realized that I needed to put this project into a book form, because it really comes down to the papacy between the Orthodox and the Catholic side. I did eventually become Catholic, but I knew that I couldn't take my eyes off of the Eastern Orthodox claims and the Eastern Orthodox objections, because I didn't satisfy them all. When I made the decision to become Catholic, I didn't get to everything as much as I wanted to. Despite me praying for the answers, I gained my confidence towards Catholicism, but that doesn't mean I resolved everything. So I knew I was going to have to make it somewhat of a lifetime study. So I, continued to build my library, continue to talk with Orthodox clergy, lay experts, theologians. And then, a lot of people know me online from getting onto Reason and Theology, where we've had a lot of Orthodox people on there, have had a lot of discussions. We've had debates. And since then, my research has continued to augment. I'm interested in the Oriental Schism in the 5th century, which leads to the Miaphysite Schism, which today comprises the Oriental Orthodox. Some people are familiar with them, but in terms of my writing projects, a lot of it still orbits around this issue with the Latin and the Greek schism that tragically took place in the 11th century.
So, what was the thing, if you could put your finger on it, like, that kept you from going Orthodox? Was there any one particular thing? And kind of a follow-up to that, maybe you can weave this in. Was there ever a period of time when you felt like you wanted to become Orthodox, where you're like, yeah, I'm starting to get convinced by this, and maybe I should do that?
Yeah. So initially, what led me towards Catholicism over Orthodoxy was a number of things. As a Protestant, I was an Augustinian thinker, so I was naturally more attracted to the doctrine of grace and predestination, for example, that you find in St. Augustine, and that gets developed in the Dominican tradition, and which was taught and defended by St. Thomas Aquinas. Also, St. Anselm of Canterbury and his teaching on the Cur Deus Homo, the incarnation, why Christ came and died, why God became flesh. Some of these doctrines aren't as valued today amongst the Orthodox, the atonement, for example. So little things like that people don't tend to think about today, those were on my mind when I initially looked into Orthodoxy. But eventually it became clear to me that from the sources, I thought that the papacy and the Filioque, which are the two biggest outstanding issues still dividing the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church today, I think that the sources moved the needle in the direction of the Catholic side.
So when you look at the issue, because people, and I'm working through your book right now, and I just finished reading up the part where you were talking about the schism, how people put this number of 1054 AD, but really there were ruptures before that happening.
Yeah.
And I'm reading things that are going back to the third and fourth centuries, and different people saying different things like that, which when I was studying this in seminary, that's not what we were told. It was just like 1054, somebody just decided, yep, we're done. And the church split. I mean, we didn't get a very full treatment of it, but when you're looking at that, you're seeing, so if I understand you correctly, you're seeing the Filioque and the doctrine of the papacy pre-schism. So is that sort of what caused you to think to yourself, well, I want to remain what's in line with the earliest teachings of the church?
Yeah, that's what it came to. As an Anglican, I was slightly pre-programmed for Orthodoxy, right? Because I didn't think the papacy was scriptural. I didn't think it was historical. I had a lot of the classical arguments that you would have found in some of those Anglican scholarly responses to Newman, but Edward Pusey and Mosley and other Anglicans that argued against the papacy. And it's interesting, a lot of the Orthodox apologetics that you see today against the papacy is really just the Anglican arguments that were being made in the 1800s and early 1900s. So I was slightly pre-programmed for the Orthodox side. And you asked if there was ever a time where I wanted to go Orthodox. So there certainly was a time. And in fact, I even got so involved with the parish, I enrolled as a catechumen and was almost sure that I was going to become an Eastern Orthodox.
Was that while you were Anglican still, or when you were a Catholic?
So I became Catholic. Okay, I was a Catholic for about a year, and what I had researched in the Latin patristics, medieval scholasticism, and the dogmatic Catholic tradition in the pre-modern to the postmodern period, I had been enmeshed in that. So when I when it comes down to brass tacks, you actually got to go to a Catholic parish.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I went to a Catholic parish, I did experience some of the worst things that people can now, expect. And so after a year of that, I thought to myself, I got to go back to the drawing board.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
That's pretty. I wonder how common that is. I mean, you like some of the guys that you see who are like these super hardcore Orthodox apologists. A lot of them were Catholic at one point in time, and I wonder if they had a similar experience that you had.
Yeah, because it's becoming a more, but I didn't want to just break my vows, So I would go to Catholic Mass on Saturday evenings, to the vigil, and or Sunday evenings, but then I'd be at the Orthodox liturgy on Sunday morning, and then I'd go to the priest's house for catechumenical instructions, and but when I was there, what I was looking to get away from Catholicism. I wanted to get away from. I thought Catholicism was turning out to be like it was uncovered as this liberal mock of apostolic Christianity. And I wanted to go to antiquity and history and asceticism and the original faith. And I thought that the Eastern Orthodox Church, could be the place for that. But when I started visiting the Orthodox churches, they definitely had that mystique of liturgical reverence and things like that. But I started to notice some things happening, being said, that I was going to have to cope with in the same way I had already been coping with as a Catholic. And so I thought to myself, well, wait a minute, Eric, if you're going to have to, you're already saying in the Catholic Church that, you're here because it's the true church. There's a human element and a divine element. The human element is fallible. It could be scandalous. That doesn't mean you have to leave the church. If I'm already coming up with that excuse as a Catholic, but then I'm going to have to reproduce the same thing as an Orthodox, well, maybe I should stay put here and study this a little bit more. So that's when I handed in my resignation as a catechumen and said, listen, before I destroy my baptismal vow as a Catholic and just leave, I'm going to have to study this more. And so that's when I just started, praying more, getting on my knees and begging the Lord for the sake of my soul, my wife, my kids, to brighten the light for my feet so that I know where to put my steps. And just started studying the most reliable scholars. I tried to learn as much as I could from objective historians from all kinds of backgrounds. And that's when I started writing on the papacy, the Filioque, to learn if I'm going to be Orthodox, it's because they were right about the papacy and the Filioque. It comes down to that. It sounds very it almost sounds very superficial from people, people who might be coming from like a more charismatic background. They might be thinking, no, you fast and pray and then God gives you a sign. All this stuff about doctrine and Filioque and triadology and papacy and government, you don't have to be reading all that stuff. So sometimes if my listeners can be from that background, they kind of get this sense like, Eric, it can't be like this, right? It can't be like this. Well, unfortunately, if you're going to enter into the domain of Catholic Orthodox dialogue, invariably, you are going to have to get into theology, history, councils, canons, and everything involved. So if the Orthodox were correct about the papacy and the Filioque, then I knew I was going to have to become Eastern Orthodox, regardless of how I felt about it. However, if they were wrong about that, then I could not become Orthodox, because that would basically be a falsification for them, because they've made so much of their identity based upon that, condemning the West for those two reasons, that if those two reasons were to be nullified, they would no longer have any standing ground to be out of communion with the Catholic West. And I noticed I started to develop this like automatic rebound points for orthodoxy. Anytime I had a problem in the Catholic Church, I always thought, oh, automatic point for the Orthodox, automatic point for the Orthodox. But you can't do that. You got to study each thing on its own, you know? So when I started to study orthodoxy on its own 2 feet, that's when I realized, okay, there was wisdom in me hesitating on becoming Orthodox. And I learned more that confirmed my position as a Catholic.
Now, one of the things I want to make sure that people understand about my attitude about this, and I think you would say the same thing, Erick, I'm not here to beat up on the Orthodox. I'm not here to try to talk about how bad they are, something like that. I don't think that. But one of the things that you said that I wanted to emphasize is, you talked about the problems that you experienced on the ground in Catholicism, like in your parish. And then you talked about that the answer to that isn't necessarily just go become Orthodox, because they don't have any of those same things that they're working through. So for Catholics out there who are frustrated with their experience of Catholicism, they've studied the church fathers, they've studied the church, and they have this, I don't even know what you want to call it, kind of this bright-eyed view of what Catholicism is going to be like, especially for a lot of us converts, because we did.
Yeah.
You think, oh, I'm going into the one true church and everyone's going to be unified and there's going to be all this reverence and beauty and truth, and it's just going to be the foundation of everything is right here. And then you go to a Catholic parish sometimes and it feels like it's anything but that.
Yeah.
And my parish, full disclosure, is amazing, but I know this is an experience that a lot of people have gone through, and it sounds like you went through that as well. And it seems to be in that context that a lot of Orthodox come in and say, well, you're really not in the right church now, because if you were, you wouldn't be going through those things.
Right.
But is what you're telling me that some of the same problems that we have, maybe not the same exact problems, but variations from what people expect, what they experience, that exists in Orthodoxy as well?
It does. Yes, absolutely. And we'd have to have a whole course on the kinds of things that you're going to face as an Orthodox. If you're perceptive and you're a hunter for consistency. Some people, they go to the Orthodox Church and they follow the come and see, touch and smell. They see everything, the smells, the bells, the mystique of the liturgy. And when they put aside all earthly cares, they receive Holy Communion. They rest assured that they're in the truth. They don't need to worry about anything. But you're definitely going to face some trials and some scandals. And in particular, you have certain scandals, and I don't want to, we're not here to beat up the Orthodox, but there are certain inconsistencies that you might face that could potentially scandalize. And that's not something that is missing in the Orthodox world. I saw it, and I knew I was going to have to deal with it. And I'll give you one example. When I was trying to leave the Catholic Church to become Orthodox, I noticed that some of the Orthodox were very respectful of Catholics. So, you could find an Orthodox priest that really loves Pope Benedict the 16th. And I observed one festival in the local town here where I live, where an Orthodox priest opened up the convocation by giving the microphone to the Catholic bishop of the city.
Wow.
And I thought to myself, why is this happening? I don't want to, why does he think that the Catholic bishop is like a Christian and is a good guy? And, and then I started to learn that there's that the Orthodox have a little Vatican II of their own. And I know this can be a little confusing for people who might not be familiar, but, ever since the ecumenical movement started in the beginning of the 20th century, if going for the Orthodox, we're going back to the 1920s. So this is 40 years before Vatican II. There was a rift and started in Greece, and it worked its way out from Greece into lots of different Orthodox patriarchates and autocephalous churches. And you could basically call it the ecumenical movement. Obviously the Catholic Church came in late. When the Orthodox were doing this, the Catholics were still a little bit more, very strict. But then when you had Vatican II, things started to change. We became more open to ecumenism. We've had a lot of joint faith, interfaith meetings with Orthodox people. And so, you don't want to just up and leave Catholicism for Orthodoxy because your imagination tells you that the Orthodox Church has been immune from some of the confusion that has overswept all Christian groups in the 20th century going into the 21st. You're also going to have to build up this whole human versus divine element in the Orthodox Church in order to cope, and so you don't want to be under any illusions that you're somehow going to find ecclesiastical paradise in Eastern Orthodoxy. And some people who doubt that, just go do it and try, and do it for a few years, and I guarantee you're going to have a little bit more of a sober-minded assessment. Like, maybe I did have a little bit of an illusion when I first came in. But it really comes down, and for me, it really comes down to this. Just like with a Jehovah's Witness versus, Catholic view on Christ. Jehovah's Witness believe that Christ is not one with consubstantial with the Father. They're wrong about that. That means they're wrong about a lot of things.
Yeah.
So that clearly shows that they're not right. So for me, it still comes down to the issues that divided the East and the West. Are the Orthodox right? And if they're right, then give them the credit for being right. If there's problems with their opposition to the papacy and the Filioque, then that cannot be ignored, no matter how good you feel in the Orthodox Church.
So let's dig into that just a little bit. And I know that that's a huge topic, but for people who are listening that haven't really done a lot of that deep dive yet, can you, I guess, as briefly as you can, understanding that this is a huge topic, what was it that convinced you when it came to the Filioque and the papacy? Was there any kind of thematic type of evidence that convinced you, or was there one particular thing for each of those, or how did you come to understand that the Orthodox were wrong when it came to those two issues?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, going back to the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, when the schism finally, there was an incubation period. Finally, there's that symbolic date of 1054. But it really, the first thing that the Byzantines had an issue with the Catholics with is the use of the kind of bread that they were using in Mass. The Greeks understood that leavened bread, so raise a raised loaf with leaven, and that's what made the Divine Liturgy valid. So the bread actually doesn't change into the body of Christ if it's unleavened. That's how they didn't, so they accused the Latins when the Latins started using flat wafers, that the Eucharist was actually not even valid anymore. So that's a huge accusation.
Yeah.
That was the first thing, the first shot fired, I guess you could say, was that. Of course, the Latins responded with some of their own things, like, the Greeks took the Filioque out of the creed, which was preposterous. The Filioque was not in the original creed. So that's what made the second shot was the Greeks learned, what are you talking about, Filioque? That's a heresy. Not only is it wrong to add something to the creed, but it's a heretical doctrine to say that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. That's what Filioque means. So then you've got, so the invalid Mass, a heretical doctrine about God, a criminal violation of the Creed, and then after enough going back and forth, the Latins eventually said, well, what are we doing all this arguing about? You guys just need to submit to the throne of St. Peter. So then that adds the next thing, is the power and prerogative of the successor of St. Peter. So those issues really comprise the original break in communion. For me and my research, I went to the rules that both sides have to play by: Scripture, tradition, and the conciliar consensus of the Church Fathers. For both Catholics and Orthodox, those are like monuments of the Christian faith. You want to know what the definition of Christian doctrine is? You've got to go to Scripture, you've got to go to tradition, and you've got to go to the conciliar consensus of the Church Fathers, the preeminent saints and doctors of the Church, but also the bishops who gathered in the 7 ecumenical councils. So if the rules are those monuments define the Christian faith, well, let's go into those monuments to see if the papacy's there, if the Filioque's there, or if it's not. If it's not there, boom, the Orthodox win the debate. That doesn't mean they're the true church, but it does mean that they win the debate between Catholics and Orthodox, right? And so from my research, and this is just, the documented form on the papacy, I found that those monuments contain the very substance and essence of what we codified in our dogmatic councils about the papacy, going all the way up to Vatican I. So because of that, if we're playing by the rules, the Orthodox are obliged to accept it. They're obliged to accept the substance of the papal doctrine. Same thing with the Filioque. I wrote a book on the Filioque as well. I don't know if I have it with me around here, but I did the same process. Went into the monuments, Scripture, tradition, the Fathers, and I found that the Filioque was far too embedded into those monuments, that to condemn it as a heresy is to condemn the monuments. See if that makes sense. So, yeah. So because of that, I no matter how good I feel about Orthodoxy, as much as I respect the Orthodox, as much as I think that there's so much they excel above us in many ways, they're definitely on the outside looking far better than at least the Roman ritual and the Roman rite, the Latin rite, Catholicism for a long time. But how many times does Jesus have to say something for it to be true? Just one time.
Yeah.
How many times do you have to deny something that's true before you become completely wrong? Just one thing. So so those two outstanding problems are what convinced me that I would have to be a Catholic in order to stay faithful to the rules of Scripture, tradition, and the consensus of the Fathers.
So what you're saying is, when you studied the Scriptures, the councils, and the Church Fathers, you're seeing evidence of the papacy, you're seeing evidence of the Filioque. Now, of course, you would say after the schism, we're going to see those things, because that's the reasons for the division. So you're going to have the West arguing in favor, the East arguing against. But you're saying that pre-schism, you're seeing those things taught, which I think is powerful, because when the church is united and there is no division of East and West, the East is going to accept everything the West says. The West is going to accept everything the East says. Now you're setting up a scenario where now you have to, as the East, say, well, all that stuff about the Filioque and the papacy, that we once accepted, or we're in communion at least with people who accepted it, now we have to backpedal on that.
Absolutely. That you hit the nail on the head there. The Orthodox Church claims that both Latin and Greek traditions for the first 1,000 years is part of the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So to go back and say, well, the Western Fathers taught that, the Eastern Fathers didn't. That is to basically go back and impose a division upon the root. That how can you go back to a tree and cut its root in half? You can't do that. Both sides have to be essentially required and allowed to stay there. You see, and that's like what you're trying to say there. So if both East and West are accepting of these things, or sometimes if we can only find evidence of it in the West, because sometimes the evidence is sparse. Sometimes they didn't write everything and preserve everything they wrote down. So sometimes we find a little bit more evidence for the Filioque in the West, for example. That still counts.
It's all the same church at that point, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, there's no, I like to say, just like St. Paul said, there's no Jew or Greek in Christ. So also there's no Eastern or Western hemispheres in Christ. You know, there is one, it's one divine life. Of course, we talk about the legitimate distinctions between East and West, of course. But in terms of the supernatural life that God is giving us through the Holy Church, you can't have one set of rules, one set of faith, one set of morals for one side, and then another contrary set of faith and morals on the other side. And this is something that the Greek Orthodox have always accepted all throughout the medieval period. Even John of Damascus, Georgius Scholarius, 15th century Orthodox saint, if the Western Fathers were heretical, then both Catholicism and Orthodoxy is out of business.
Now, let me ask you this though: do the Orthodox, do they try to make the same claim and say, well, no, you Catholics should accept what the Eastern Fathers said pre-schism, and we have all of these Eastern Fathers that deny the Filioque and deny the papacy? Is it kind of just a tit for tat at that point in time, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's essentially what they do. That's essentially what many Orthodox. Now, like if you go in the scholarly domain, most Orthodox scholars, they already accept that the West taught the papacy and the Filioque, and they'll say the East did not. So functionally, they already kind of violate the rules, because they're imposing a division. They're already imposing that division. But if you're talking to like somebody who's really intent upon defending Eastern Orthodoxy over Catholicism, then what they're going to say is that, no, Eric, you're reading the papacy and the Filioque into the sources. So, you see Peter, you see head of the church, you think Vatican I. Right. You see from the Father through the Son, you're thinking Filioque. But there's an Eastern Orthodox way of reading these things that's the correct way of reading those things. And part of my task in this book was to let's look at those sources and see what is it what the Orthodox are saying it is, or is it what the Catholic side is saying it is? And that's what I try to afford the reader the opportunity to look at the sources and to decide.
So it's a little bit of a different argument. Instead of saying, well, we've got these Eastern, and I understand they're imposing the division, which in and of itself is, probably something we shouldn't do. But for the sake of the argument, they're not saying, well, you have all these Western Fathers pre-schism that say this. Well, we have just as many Eastern Fathers that say the exact opposite. They're saying, no, your claim about the Western Fathers saying this, that's a false claim. You're misinterpreting
That's
them.
right.
Okay, so that's a completely different argument. Okay, I understand.
Yeah.
I understand. Yeah, well, that's very interesting. Which to me goes back to the whole issue of authority. You know, and I'm a former Protestant, just like you. I wasn't. You know, I was a Methodist, so I wasn't a Reformed Baptist like you. I wasn't like that hardcore. So I know I got my fair share of Reformed Baptist friends. I know the world that you came from.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's night and day. But it's weird because as anti-Catholic as a lot of Reformed Baptists are, I find that they're closer to Catholicism than they realize because they have such a high view of Scripture and they have a high view of ecclesiastical authority. It's just put at the local level rather than like at a more corporate level.
Yeah,
so,
it's a little papacy.
Yeah, it is exactly. Look, my pastor, John MacArthur, he's like, I call him like the Pope of the, you either got MacArthur or you got Piper. These guys are the popes of certain modern evangelical Western Reformed, whatever. But when you were coming through that, no question, the issue of authority was a huge piece of this that led you out of Anglicanism into Catholicism. So for people who maybe aren't as familiar with this whole idea, who is the authority in Eastern Orthodoxy? Is there a central authority, or how does that whole issue play out? Because that's for a lot of my listeners who are exploring Catholicism, that authority issue is the big piece of it. So what's the Eastern Orthodox position on that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of overlap, in fact, surprisingly. Sometimes Catholics can drift a little bit into their own imagination about why the Orthodox are wrong. So sometimes Catholics can get the idea that, everything is about the big boss. And if we have the big boss who can come in and just say what it is, we got no more conflicts and bada bing, bada boom, everything's done. Everybody knows what needs to be believed. And so they think, well, when you have that kind of a structure of the big boss able to come in and resolve everything, then you have ecclesiastical unity, you have ecclesiastical peace. But the Orthodox, they've got, all kinds of big bosses that are equal to each other. And so when one big boss says, this is how it is, another big boss might, take his cigar out of his mouth and say, no, it ain't. So it's not final. And so you can have like the schisms that develop, to be honest, there's a bad extremity in both models. When you have a bunch of big bosses that are equal, well, if all of them start fighting with each other, then the sheep of Christ don't know where to go, right? So that's a problem. But in the Catholic Church, when you have a big boss who happens to be a problem, that also has a potential extremity for making the sheep wonder, So sometimes Catholics can overplay the argument in thinking that, the papacy makes us immune from these issues. And sometimes we can overplay the argument for the Orthodox that, just because they have an equal government of patriarchs, that, all they get is confusion and schism. So there's a potential extremity for problems on both sides. But here's the thing. The Catholic Church believes that, we have the bishops are the successors of the apostles. And so the Episcopal College is basically the supreme authority in the church, surrounding, under and with the Roman pontiff as the heir of Peter, the heir of St. Peter. And the Orthodox Church, they believe that each local region has a local church, okay? But then there's a bunch of local churches within a metropolitanate. So you have a metropolitan who's a bishop, and he's over the bishops of smaller churches, but he's not different than them in authority. He has certain canonical assignments that are different than the other bishops, but they're basically the same: bishop, metropolitan. And then you've got a patriarch, so you've got local church, metropolitan, then a bigger umbrella, a patriarch, patriarchate. And the patriarch is equal with a metropolitan and a bishop, but again, he's got canonical privileges that make his role a little bit different than the metropolitans underneath him, and of course the bishops underneath the metropolitans. When something cannot be resolved on a local level, it can get kicked up to the synodal level, at which case you have a synod that could resolve matters. When a synod cannot resolve matters, you can kick it up to a higher level, eventually to the point where if it's infecting more than one patriarchate, they can call an ecumenical council. The problem there is, how do you call an ecumenical council in the Orthodox Church? And how do you procure agreement with the patriarchs when you can't have an ecumenical council? And that's where they run into their difficulties with authority. At that point, something doesn't become universally authoritative until everybody agrees. But the problem with that is, it sounds nice because, wow, that's cool. If I don't agree, then it doesn't happen. If we all agree, then it does happen. The problem is it can be a little bit torturous, because when a certain truth needs to be mandated, it can't become a dogma until everybody accepts it.
And how many patriarchs are there right now?
So
wasn't there 7 of them? Isn't that like there's 7 patriarchs historically?
So there was 5. So started off with 4. Then Constantinople came on. Actually, started with 3, then 4, then 5.
Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch, right?
Yeah, Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, then Jerusalem.
Yeah. Okay.
Then you had Constantinople. So you had the 5-headed government in the first millennium, the pentarchic government. But then, as the Orthodox moved on, they developed other autocephalous, self-governing churches. So today, like Moscow, for example, is a patriarch. And so you've got, I think there's 14 self-governing churches. It could be 14, 15, or 16. Okay. I know the Orthodox Church of America is disputed on whether they are.
Aren't they under the Russian patriarch?
So they're thought to be, but that's how it's understood at Constantinople. But the OCA headquarters, they consider themselves autocephalous.
So autocephalous, for people that don't know, means self-governing.
Yeah.
But okay, so, and I know this is kind of like nerdy, but like self-governing, does that mean that they can create their own doctrine? Does that mean they don't have any accountability outside of themselves, or does that just mean that they don't need to report to somebody, like, practically?
Yeah. So no. So theoretically speaking, to be quite fair to the Orthodox, no, they can't just make their own doctrine. They are accountable to their brother bishops. So if one patriarch were to start acting out of tradition, there could be potentially a movement by the other patriarchs to intervene upon the situation. But it really becomes a matter of quantity.
Yeah.
Because if you don't get enough, then you might not be able to do anything. So like right now, you've got Moscow versus Constantinople. That's massive fracture in the Orthodox Church. The Russian Orthodox Church is the largest population of Orthodox Christians in the world. And they can't go and receive communion at the churches of Constantinople, the churches of Greece, the churches of Egypt and Alexandria. So, I mean, it's something that's wreaked havoc on the Orthodox world. So what's going to happen now?
How does that get resolved? Like, how do they deal with that?
So, it's really time and change of minds. Maybe the next successor in Constantinople will say, I was wrong. And then they're all back together.
Wow.
But, and to be quite fair, sometimes in the Catholic Church, we've had periods where things didn't get resolved right away. So, for example, when we had two claimants to the papacy in the 15th, in the 13th to 14th century, then we had a third one. That took 40 years before we finally consolidated one singularly acknowledged pope. But that's the exception in Catholicism. Whenever there is a question over who is really the pope, that's really the only thing that puts a stall on authoritative interventions. Besides that, in the Catholic Church, if a pope calls an ecumenical council, it's called. And once agreements are made, boom, letters are written, signatures are signed, and then everybody in the world who's a Catholic has to submit to the decrees. It's not like that in the Orthodox Church unless all of the patriarchs agree, or next to the major majority, agree. So you might have one outlier that's a heretic. They'll take care of that like a paper plate. Boom, you're the outlier. You're the small voice. You're the minority. We don't need to listen to what you're saying. But it can be a tough process because you don't always have a majority. And when you don't have a majority and you have something like a sizable quantity here and a sizable quantity on the other side, you could potentially have a very long-lasting division.
Yeah, because if everyone is, technically equal, then if you even just have one person, you can't just disregard that one patriarch and say, well, you don't matter.
Yeah. What they have to do is they have to basically cut the floor underneath their feet by saying, oh, well, that guy's a heretic.
So does this happen? I know there's that schism between Constantinople and Moscow, but is this, when you look at the history of the East, is it a history that is filled with these types of issues?
Amazingly, the Orthodox have actually navigated quite well. They've actually not been as all over the place as sometimes people think. They have had their divisions, but they don't seem to have created like two versions of orthodoxy. The Eastern Orthodox their ship has been largely unified over the centuries, but you do have these divisions like Moscow and Constantinople. I really don't think that this whole thing about who has the final authority, I don't actually gravitate to that as the strongest way to resolve who's right or wrong. In the Catholic and Orthodox divide. I think what you got to do is you just got to go back to the monuments that both sides share as what defines the Christian faith. What is the Christian faith? Okay. What Scripture, tradition, and the consensus of the fathers teach. For Catholics, we say Scripture, tradition, and the magisterium. I just say consensus of the fathers because the Orthodox don't tend to use the word magisterium. So if we go back to the rules, like the pirates say, what does the code say?
Yeah.
We go back to the codes, then I think the Catholic side emerges as the correct side. Whether we can handle things practically better or not, it really doesn't matter. The issue goes back to who is more faithful to the sources of the past that we all know can't be questioned.
Now, we talked about the Filioque and the papacy. Those are kind of the big rocks. What are some of the other differences that you are aware of between, like, theological differences I would want us to talk about between Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism?
Yeah, so the Orthodox are going to have issues with the Immaculate Conception. That's a Mariological doctrine that the Catholic Church is, dogmatized in the 19th century. So that's one thing. They hold that Mary is sinless, but they don't usually. They're not as comfortable saying that she was immaculately conceived. In other words, that she was born freed from original sin, because their understanding of original sin usually is more simplified. They think it just means death. And the ancestral curse that came from Adam's sin is just death and the disintegration of good. So in that case, Mary got sick. Mary was, she could have been, she had a virus. She could have had aches and pains in her bones. She could have had all kinds of things that come as a result of that curse. So for them to say that she was born free from original sin would mean that she's free from, so she's born like an angel.
Penalty of all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, the Catholic side would agree. If original sin is defined just like that, then yeah, that seems absurd. But the Catholic Church has defined that she was preserved from all stain of original sin, which has a little bit more of a qualified meaning. And what it means is the disorder of the soul that makes what Paul calls the flesh, the passions of the flesh, that she was preserved from. She was preserved from that interior child of wrath that Paul describes in Ephesians chapter 2. She wasn't preserved from everything that came as a result of the fall. And which is why the majority of the church fathers believe that she did die, but she was assumed into heaven afterwards. So the Immaculate Conception, they also have a question on purgatory.
Wait, back up 1 second. Did they believe in the Assumption?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. They believe that's the whole issue, was just, did she die? Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they believe that. So they believe that she was sinless. They believe that she was assumed.
That's right.
It's just a little bit of a difference of what it means to be immaculately conceived because of the difference in definition between original sin, which makes sense if they are not gravitated towards the Augustine stuff, and the West is. Okay. So purgatory. I've heard some Orthodox say they don't believe in purgatory. It's but then I've heard they have these other ideas like toll houses and different things that are kind of the same, but
so they all believe in a post-mortem purification for souls that were not heroically holy in this life, but they definitely have an issue with a physical fire being involved in the purification of the saints in the church suffering, right? They definitely don't think it's a literal fire. Some Latin theologians did think it was a real fire. In fact, some Greek theologians thought it was a real fire. Gregory of Nyssa, I think, is one example. You've got a lot of fathers that spoke about it as a real fire. But the developed medieval Byzantine view was against that. So they think that if we could define purgatory as a process of purification that doesn't involve physical fire, then we get closer. But then they also take issue with the idea of satisfying temporal guilt. They have a problem with that because in their understanding, our problem is more ontological than it is legal. And so the Catholic Church understands guilt in two ways: eternal guilt, temporal guilt. And that's not necessarily one-to-one proportionately with how holy we are ontologically. So they quibble about this, and so some have an issue. Now, that's actually waning because one of their councils, the Council of Jerusalem in 1672, which was accepted by all the Orthodox patriarchs, basically teaches the doctrine of purgatory, legal and ontological.
Really? Because the Catechism doesn't say there's a literal fire.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So we're probably pretty close. We're probably closer than people might think on that one too.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So are there any other major ones that you're aware? I mean, I know you're aware of all of them, but I'm not aware of all of them. So tell me.
So the other outstanding issue today is the the essence and energies distinction. But this is the developed teaching of that we see in like the Greek East with Maximus the Confessor, and as developed more broadly by Gregory Palamas. Okay.
Yeah, is this? I've tried to learn about the whole, and I'm not. Again, the reason why I'm talking to you about this is because I haven't like nerded out totally on all these differences. But the essence and energies thing, sometimes some of these things for like, a non whatever you want to call it. That's somewhat.
Philosopher. It's a lot of philosophy.
So I'm cool with that. But like as far as the nuanced differences
Right.
of all these things, essence and energy, I guess I just don't understand what makes that Orthodox versus Catholic. You're talking about who God is versus what God does.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You're basically talking about, who he is and what he does. There's God, and then there's his actions. What he does when he acts. I think the word energies, because the Greek theologians took on the Aristotelian term energeia, energies, and they started to use that to describe God's activities. But for us Western-minded people, we could just use the word activities. It's much simpler because energies already sounds like something else. It doesn't sound like,
Yeah. Are we really far off on this, or is it just kind of people making a big deal out of nothing?
Yeah, so I think there is something to be seen in. There's a difference. I do think there's a difference, but I don't think it's of the kind of difference that should result in a dogmatic divide.
Yeah.
It's just, it's really, how did Platonism influence Western theologians versus the way it influenced Eastern theologians? I happen to think that, and I'm not an expert in this area, by the way. This is a whole field of its own. I happen to think that Neoplatonism really took root in possibly Saint Gregory of Nyssa, especially for sure in Maximus the Confessor. But there's no question that a guy like Palamas is teaching some of the things that Plotinus and Proclus taught in their pagan philosophy, but it was baptized in order to explain Christian doctrine. Whereas in the West, Augustine, obviously Saint Augustine certainly had Platonist thinking patterns, but the way that we understood different philosophical dilemmas when it comes to the simplicity of God and the way that has a bearing on his decision, his will, God's will to do something. We have a much stronger view of divine simplicity than I think a guy like Gregory Palamas. But both are admitting divine simplicity, that God is simple. But the way that Neoplatonistic, the way that it structures its understanding of the one, God, bring it into Christian theology, and the many, meaning the what, like a telescoping of being. They understand God to be more of like a formal cause of all things.
Yeah.
Whereas in Catholic West, we're thinking more efficiency. God is the efficient cause of all things, and so this tends to have consequences for how we understand creation, salvation, and things like that. But for the life of me, I just can't see how it could be a dogmatic division. Because even within the West, we have like a distinction between Aquinas and the Franciscan school, for example, which doesn't take everything Aquinas said to heart, actually has its own very, very different way of thinking on matters related. So I think we just need to be happy that there are different schools of thought on this. And I think the Catholic Church could embrace I'm not an expert on this. For me, I don't know how it could be reconciled, but it's possible that we could allow it as an acceptable school of thought.
Yeah.
As long as certain qualifications are made such that, the beatific vision, for example, is not denied, because some Greek theologians think that that's a false teaching.
Really?
Yeah, because we behold the essence of God, whereas for the Orthodox, the essence is beyond being. It's not, you can't perceive it at all. So the only thing we're perceiving is the actions or the activities or the energies, and that's definitely dogmatic for us. So if the Orthodox want to take that to the, if they want to take that to the schoolyard and scrap about it, we have to keep our beatific vision doctrine. There's no way we're going to get rid of that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some other practical things. So Orthodox priests get married, no problem. Divorce is allowed in the Orthodox Church, up to 3 divorces. Is that right? Is that a universal thing, or is that just kind of like this patriarch does it, that one doesn't? Like,
yeah.
I'm just thinking of like the things that the average normal Joe Catholic would probably know about Orthodoxy and go, wait, that's different from us,
Yeah. So Orthodox, so the Orthodox and the Catholics, we both believe the priesthood is a celibate institution. So for example, if you become a priest in the Orthodox Church, you can't marry. Okay. The exception is if you're married before you're ordained. So
okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So if you get married before you're ordained, let's say you're already married, and then you say, you know what, I want to become a priest. Well, in the Orthodox Church, you can do that. Now, you can't be a bishop. So all the bishops in the Orthodox Church are celibates.
Okay.
So sometimes, you'll hear an Orthodox say, oh, the Latin West, they don't allow priests to marry. Well, what if it's such a big deal, then why do the Orthodox have a celibate episcopate? So the Orthodox understand that the priesthood is not something that they've already outruled marriage for already ordained persons.
Okay, I didn't realize that. So theoretically, though, if a guy was married, became a priest, and they said, "Hey, we want you to be a bishop. Just ditch your wife." He could do that.
So back in the past, that's what they did.
Then he could become a bishop.
So back in the 7th century, for example, you could become a bishop if you were married, but they bought another house for your wife.
Okay, so that you live like a celibate lifestyle.
Yes.
But technically you're still married. Wow, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So today, all the bishops are celibate, though. None of them are married.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's that. So there's a little difference there, but when you look at the details, it's not as different as some people think. But then the whole divorce thing. So the Orthodox still say, obviously, that divorce is wrong. They still say that divorce is wrong. And it seems as though over the centuries, they started off a little bit more strict than that they are now. It used to be that if you divorced, so it used to be that if your wife committed adultery on you, then you could divorce and remarry. But if there's any other reason to the divorce, both of y'all have to be
no remarriage. Yeah.
No remarriage. Yeah. It used to be that way. Then they added in this thing where if the wife becomes a heretic, then maybe she leaves God altogether. Then maybe you could get remarried, but not the wife. The wife couldn't remarry even after adultery. So that's how they started. Okay. Only the male could remarry. So it went from that to slowly adding in conditions that the Byzantine emperor thought was more practical. So if you had your wife who tried to poison your breakfast, believe it or not, that was if your wife tried to poison you,
could see that.
That was a reason for divorce and remarriage. So, and now today you've got like over 100 conditions where they would consider it valid to divorce your spouse and remarry, and not just the male, but now they've allowed females to remarry as well.
Okay.
And it is up to 3 times, but usually after the first time, they put real hard pressure on not getting married again. But if you insist, and you got a priest who's very, more on the lenient side, you can get a second marriage and then a third. But they're different. It's very different. The ceremony is very different. The ceremony for a second marriage is a penitential ceremony. So it doesn't have as much singing, doesn't have the crown, doesn't have all the pomp and the liturgical beauty of a first marriage. Then they purposely do that because they kind of see it as a concession to weakness.
Yeah. Well, I got a couple more questions for you, Erick. I mean, and we could go through all these things about the differences and everything like that. And I think it's kind of fascinating. And there are a lot of things to look at with there, but I want to ask just a couple more questions about like what should our attitude as Catholics be and relationship as Catholics and Orthodox? What should that look like? Because for me, I feel like, we believe as Catholics, we believe that the Orthodox churches have valid sacraments, that they have apostolic succession, whereas we distinguish them from Protestants. Protestants like broke away from these things. We don't really look at the Orthodox in the same kind of way.
Right.
But yet, depending on who you talk to, it seems like I talk to some Orthodox that are very collegial and friendly with Catholics, and we almost view each other as, how we look at Protestant as separated brethren. And it's almost like there's a closer relationship even between Catholics and Orthodox. But then I talk to some other Orthodox who it almost seems like we are the enemy. And that always puzzled me. Because I don't feel that way about Orthodox people and the Orthodox religion. But what is your perception of the relationship that we should have with one another? And talk for a minute also about the reception of sacraments in each other's churches and things like that too.
Yeah. So it really does come down to, understanding what is the right way of dealing with people who are outside of your communion. For some Orthodox, they go back to the way that Elijah treated the prophets of Baal, where he mocked them and then eventually it got violent. Well, God, obviously approved of that. God approved of Israel going into the Canaanite, sites and taking over. And then, even in the New Testament, you've got Paul, speaking very harshly about the Judaizers, using kinds of terms that are, a little bit obscene. And of course, you've got Christ who makes a whip out of cords and comes in and is driving people out of the temple. And so they try to, and of course, in the church fathers, you also have that, like Jerome can be kind of rough with his opponents. So what they'll do is they'll go into the past and they'll collect all these examples of righteous anger, and then make that the blank check application for how to be with everybody all the time.
It's handy.
Yeah. So I mean, it's understandable though. It's human nature, because we're very passionate about something. It gets on our nerves and it makes us angry. Well, we want to call it righteous anger, and if we call it righteous anger, well, we got some precedents to defend that. And they'll forget about, Jesus, who is yearning for the forgiveness of the people who are killing him, and all of the other beautiful, the humility of Paul, and all the virtues that he says in 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, a servant of the Lord must be humble, easy, slow to anger. When you're dealing with somebody who opposes you, you have to be, gentle with them in hopes that God will give them the truth.
The whole love your enemies thing gets in the way of that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, so sometimes people have an off-balanced understanding of basic New Testament spirituality. And so that calibrates the way they treat people. And if you think that God is defending all the antics and the making fun of and the rudeness, the meanness, all that stuff, well, then you don't stop. because you think it glorifies God, you know?
Mm.
So you see that on both sides. Catholics do it to Orthodox, Orthodox do it to Catholics. There has been an increase. I've sensed it from Orthodox. They call it the ortho bro blogosphere, you know, the cyber war of the Orthodox. They tend to, you know, have fake profiles like cartoon, anime, like anonymous names like Sequi113, you know, just anonymous people just chiming in. And I think that's both Catholics and Orthodox need to get away from that, and we need to understand that we need to look at the cross, look at the crucifix, and really study what's going on there. Christ did that for both friends and enemies. He did that for the worst of the worst. He did it for us. He did it for me. And if he went that far in love for me, I can go very far, and I must go very far in loving my Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters. So I think that we all need to inculcate that, and we're not going to get anywhere with the aggression. And I think we need to be calm, collected, and friendly while being serious about our differences, but in a way that recognizes that we're mature and we can handle considering the fact that we might be wrong. If I'm wrong and an Orthodox person can help me see that, I want the opportunity for that to see it to the full. And I can't do that if I have prejudices against him, and then vice versa. And then with the communion, you know, the Catholic Church has opened communion for the Orthodox on certain where scandal doesn't arise. So you can't have, like, you know, all the patriarchs going to the Vatican and receiving communion. That would be confusing, you know. But they have opened it up to the Orthodox who, for example, if they don't have access to a an Orthodox church, they can ask a Catholic priest for any of the sacraments. Well, after baptism and confirmation, they could ask for communion and penance. You know, the Orthodox Church has not opened their policy for us, though. So in many ways, it's a respectable policy, because the Catholic Church had the same policy for a long time too. But we've become far more lenient in the last 50 to 100 years.
So if you're Catholic, you're not allowed to go receive in an Orthodox church because of their rules. Because of our rules?
No.
Okay. So if you can't go to a mass, let's say you're not within range of a mass, you could, according to our rules, you could go receive at the Orthodox church, but they wouldn't let you if they knew you were Catholic.
So you can go to an Orthodox church and receive communion if they let you. But if it's a Sunday and you have access to a Catholic mass and you choose to go to an Orthodox mass instead, that's not allowed in the Catholic
That
Church.
doesn't fulfill your obligation.
Right. Yeah. But, you know, if you have no Catholic mass available to you, you could on any day. And then any other day besides Sunday, you could potentially go and receive if they allow you to. But again, prudence has to rule that. Why are you going to do that?
Yeah.
What is it that you're intending to do? Do you kind of want to just say it doesn't matter anymore? Well, if it doesn't matter anymore, now you're falling into the sin of religious indifferentism, religious pluralism, relativism, and that's where, you know, in my personal view, I think that if the next pope wanted to say, you know what, we're gonna scratch this canonical arrangement that we made after Vatican II, I would understand why, because it does cause a little bit of confusion sometimes. I think it should be reserved for when it's absolutely necessary. A Catholic has no choice but to ask an Orthodox priest, and an Orthodox person has no choice but to ask. In those circumstances, I can understand. But this thing of having like an open chalice, it can be confusing.
Yeah. Wow. So much there. Hey, before we go, Erick, I want to talk about your book for a minute.
Yeah.
This is the biggest book that I've bought in a long time. And I'm loving this, by the way. I love the way it's written. I love the way it's set up. I love your voice in this book. And I mean, I don't have time to read a lot of books, despite the fact that I've got a pile of them. But this one went right to the top. And it wasn't just because we were going to do this interview. I'm really interested in this. because these are issues that I deal with all the time with people talking to me about things. And I'm very excited about this book. What can you tell the people in closing here about the book and where they can buy it and where they can find out more about you?
Yeah. So, this book is basically 10 years of research put into documentation. That's all this is. And for those of you who are wanting to have, a full investigation into the sources, I think I do a lot of service to the Orthodox in making concessions to some of the things that they're seeing in the historical documents. But if you're Orthodox and you want to see what a Catholic might say about all the sources and how the sources are read, the rules, the hermeneutics of history, what is it that we need to prove, what counts as evidence. I even have a chapter in there on epistemological considerations. So this is why I called it revisiting, because it's been visited before. But what makes my book different is I've read the books of the past dealing with the East-West Schism, and I've recognized where we still need to kind of understand each other better, so that we're not continuing to just talk past each other. And so I try to supply some of that information at the beginning of the book. At least put it in your library, read it. And I can imagine some Orthodox might read it and might not be convinced. And that's fine. As long as you've wrestled with the sources, you have my respect. But when somebody says, the Catholic Church, the Pope, and this and that, the Filioque, but they haven't done any research on the matter, slowly, patiently, carefully, they don't really have the right to have an opinion on the issues. So I'm hoping that the book provides a chance for both Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants who are trying to peer in to study the matter.
Beautiful. And I bought
you
mine.
can get it at St. Paul Center.
That's where I got mine. Yeah,
St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology. Browse their catalog for my name. You'll see it there. Of course, you could also get it at Amazon as well.
Yeah, and I'll put a link to that in the description as well. Now, what else? What are you? Now that you got this done, like, are you going on vacation and just like chilling, or like, what are you working on now?
So I'm actually working on developing like a Patreon and a locals account where I can kind of do short little videos of courses on my books. So not just this book, but the one on the Filioque, the one on justification for Protestants. I have another book on Melchizedek and the Last Supper for Protestants. Really want to make videos for that. I also am writing a book on answering historical Protestant objections. So not the evangelical, low church Protestant things, but more like the historic Anglican objections, Presbyterian objections, that you're starting to see prop up again. You're starting to see them gain traction. And I'm writing a book on that. So that should be out in like a year or so.
Wow. Well, I'm excited for that one as well, because I deal with a lot of those objections with people too. And I look forward to that. Well, Erick, thank you so much for taking time to not only to write this book. I know how long that takes. I mean, so here's Erick's book, everybody, and here's both of my books, and they don't even get in line with all of his. And these took me forever. So I can only imagine how long this one took. Like 10 years, I heard you say something about this worth of work that went into this. So thank you for that.
Typing it out took, like 2 years. But yeah, like the study, the reading, all that stuff took a long time.
Well, thank you for doing that. And thank you for taking time to be here and for all the work that you do for all of us in the church. Erick Ybarra, everyone, make sure you check out his links, check out the stuff, and get this book. It'll be absolutely awesome. And friends, thanks once again for joining us here on Catholic Feedback. We look forward to coming back to explore more things with Catholicism, to unpack these eternal truths, and to connect them with everyday life, friends. Thank you so much, and God bless. Thanks for listening to Catholic Feedback with Keith Nestor. Send in your questions and comments to feedback@catholicfeedback.com. This podcast is brought to you by Stewardship, a mission of faith, and is also supported by our team at patreon.com/Keith Nestor. Please consider joining our support team. Catholic Feedback is a production of Down to Earth Ministries. For more information about Down to Earth or to bring me to your parish or event, visit down2earthministry.org. See you next time.